Betrayal, I learned that year, can be measured in the number of suitcases someone brings into your living room. My name is Frank Emerson. I am 71, retired from a life of medical sales, and for the last 8 years, I have been living in the house my wife Erica and I bought the day we decided to make a life together. The house sits stubborn and proud on a little rise, the kind of 3-story place people imagine when they think of legacy. Wide plank floors, a creaky staircase that remembers every footfall, windows that hold a lake's reflection like a breath held just so. Erica painted one bedroom a warm cream she loved. And even in winter, that room remembered summer. If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and subscribe. I'd also love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and while you're there, tell me your first reaction to this story. I tell you this not because I want sympathy, but because the house matters. It was where our mornings began, where the sound of her spoon against a teacup marked the hours. I know every nail and joint. I can point to the scuff on the hallway wall that Ethan once made with a mischievous bicycle. Those things were not merely objects, they were fingerprints of a life. I lived alone by choice, not because I could not find company. Widower, yes. Divorced before Erica's death, yes. Independent, absolutely. I walked the neighborhood at dawn. I kept my papers in order. I refused offers of charity and refused to move into places that smelt of antiseptic and pity. My neighbors called me stubborn. I called myself careful. So when Felicia called to say she and Greg needed a place to stay for a little while, I opened the door. I loved my daughter. I thought I knew her. I hadn't counted on how quickly familiarity morphs into possession. They arrived with 8 suitcases wedged into their sedan, 3 children trailing behind like extras. They smiled, they said polite things. They hugged me the way people hug when they want permission. It wasn't a single violent act. No forced eviction at first. It was domestic. It was the rearrangement of my life in daylight. Greg moved as if he'd always had the right to the master bedroom. He took to the central chair in the living room like a colonel taking a hill. He tossed my records into boxes, scoffed at the old food in my pantry, called my habits quaint and inconvenient. Felicia stood by with a patient smile and offered remedies for my safety. They spoke about what's best for you in tones that treated me like an obligation. The redecorating came with a pattern. Boxes labeled with future hopes, plans about when Mabel and Joseph move in, comments on the oddity of the staircase. They began to make lists that excluded me. The house that held Erica's touch was repainted, whimsically at first and then more blatantly, erasing the colors I recognized. My photographs were placed in a drawer. My books were called clutter. There were moments when I wanted to be angry enough to shout. There were other moments when I wanted to laugh at the ridiculousness. My own daughter assigning me to the gatehouse as if age were a crime. Mostly I felt puzzled, then hurt, then a slow, cold realization that they intended more than hospitality. The house began to feel like a stage where I was an actor whose lines were being rewritten without his consent. People think betrayal looks like a shout. Sometimes it looks like a suitcase dumped at your doorway. The first chapter of my fall was not dramatic. It was domestic. It taught me to read small things, paper trails in the mail, a calendar appointment labeled Bedford Lane Tour, a casual mention of the deposit we left during dinner. It taught me to listen when my grandson Ethan's eyes refused to meet mine and instead kept darting toward his parents. That look, half guilt, half terror, was the crack I would find later. So I set about pretending. I kept my routine. I made coffee. I fixed a window latch no one noticed. I watched them move into a life that looked, for everyone else, ordinary. For me, it was a slow theft, and it was only the beginning. At night, I sat on the back porch and watched the moon argue with the lake until my chest unclenched. I began keeping lists, phrases, dates, the precise time Felicia said the words I wanted to hear and then changed the subject. I kept every envelope that arrived, every notice that might hint at realtor interest. I wrote down who came by, the times Greg left in his car, the casual mentions of deposits and viewings. I learned to answer their questions lightly while noting each inconsistency. Pretending to be ordinary became a profession I performed to buy myself time, like a slow-burning plan indeed. They arrived on a clear Sunday that smelled of cut grass and diesel. an exhausted convoy wanting what they hadn't earned. I remember the slam of the trunk and how the sunlight caught the corners of their suitcases. I had been making breakfast. The toast burned because footsteps in the hall distracted me. Felicia's knock was warm and rehearsed. "Dad, we need a place to land for a bit." She hugged me as if hugging could reforge whatever gap had grown between us. Greg lingered in the doorway, smiling without warmth. The children tumbled in, Ethan, 17 and already world-weary, Nathan, quick to laugh, and little Gwen clinging to her mother's skirt. They set their suitcases like they owned space they had not earned. I played the hospitable father. I made coffee and moved plates. Felicia used words like temporary and until we get back on our feet. Greg spoke about jobs and logistics with the calm of a man used to negotiating outcomes. I noticed small things. Greg unlatched my bedroom door without asking, took notes in a small pad, and always seemed to know when I would be out. Within hours my house felt rearranged. The master bedroom became Greg's domain. He draped a jacket over my chair and complained about curtains. He labeled preserves expired, and began moving my records to a storage room. Felicia said little, but her jaw tightened in agreement when he suggested the gatehouse downstairs for my safety, claiming the staircase could be dangerous in winter. No single blow felled me. It was the steadiness of domestic decisions. My office, once lined with postal memorabilia, became an entertainment room for the kids. Photos were shifted, my books labeled clutter. They made lists, when Mabel and Joseph move in, and spoke of plans that made no room for me. I watched them plan a life that excluded the man who paid the taxes. Ethan pulled me aside once while rinsing dishes. His voice was a thread. "They've put down a deposit on Bedford Lane," he said. "They liked the model room." He avoided my gaze. The words landed like cold metal. My grandson's confession made the betrayal a thing with roots, not a momentary lapse. His shame felt heavier than his years. Then came the family meeting. They arrived with glossy brochures and a confident calm. Bedford Lane was presented as a community where seniors thrive, amenities listed like a sales pitch. Felicia spoke of social events. Greg detailed caregivers and schedules. When I resisted, Greg softened his voice and suggested guardianship might be an option if decisions were unsafe. The threat was polite and lethal. I left that night with a coldness in my gut. My daughter squeezed my hand as if sealing a promise. It felt instead like a signature on a document that would not have my interests. I lay awake listening to the house, the slow settling of floors, the lake's distant exhale, and catalogued small betrayals. The way Felicia answered my mail questions, Greg's frequent calls to his mother, the offhand remarks about deposits. I watched them inhabit rooms with the liberty of people who believed they belonged. For now it was an invasion dressed as hospitality. Its cruelty was in its courtesy. I learned to keep my temper measured and to watch closely while pretending to sleep. The suitcases at my door, once simply luggage, had become a symbol of assumption, of a life repacked without my consent. I began to understand that the hardest part of being betrayed by family is that they do it with your face in mind. I tried talking to Felicia once, in the quiet between her unpacking and the sitcom noise from the study. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Erica taught me to fold napkins. "Is this temporary?" I asked. She smiled without meeting my eyes. "Of course," she said. "Just until we get back on our feet." Her tone was soft. The promise felt thin. Greg invited his parents to see the place, and they came with polite smiles. Mabel admired the view and sighed about the downstairs. Joseph measured rooms with a loud, practical habit. Plans were made in front of me that never asked what I wanted. Neighbors took notice. Mrs. Holland dropped off casseroles and worried. I kept a ledger of small humiliations. Greg changing a lock for security without telling me. Felicia redirecting a bank call to her phone, a realtor's card left in my mailbox with "potential buy" scribbled on the back. Those small betrayals accumulated like stones in my pockets until I could hardly move. By the time they suggested the gatehouse again, it no longer sounded like concern. It sounded like a plan. I began to watch closely, pretending to be oblivious while cataloging every move. They began to edit my life like an editor removes an awkward paragraph. Carefully, efficiently, without a thought for the rhythm that made the story whole. By the time the second week arrived, my office had become what they called a family room. My maps, postal memorabilia, and stacks of correspondence, things I had collected over decades, were packed in boxes and shoved into a corner labeled storage. My records, once laid out to be chosen on Sunday evenings, were wrapped in plastic and banished to a junk room. Someone had indeed changed my world quietly. The change worked like a solvent on habit. Greg took to rearranging the mantel as if appointing himself curator. He moved a photograph of Erica to a drawer and replaced it with a family portrait that featured him and Felicia with smiles as if they had always been central to the family story. He bragged about optimizing space and suggested new cabinets for efficiency. I watched him like a man watching a termite at work, small and precise, and I catalogued every new distance he put between the life I had built and their plans. Felicia's voice in those days was the voice of a negotiator who believed her ends justified mild deceit. She spoke about safety in a language molded to my vulnerabilities, about the stairs and the unpredictability of age. She organized a visit by a physician to examine me, and the doctor, polite and wanting no trouble, suggested some minor changes that Felicia had already drafted into a checklist. The physician's words were steady and clinical. They made the fears feel authorized. The more they justified, the more they normalized my exclusion. Friends dropped by and found the house in flux. Some thought my daughter was helping. I would find a replacement for an old chair, its upholstery suddenly unsuitable in Greg's eyes. I found my hatbox gone, my letters filed in a drawer labeled old. One April afternoon I stood in my hallway while a mover loaded a crate with postal clippings I had saved since the 60s. Items that were more memory than matter. I felt a rush of anger that made me dizzy. Ethan tried to be my ally in small, fragile ways. He left my car windows washed, picked up magazines I'd mislaid, and once returned a book to a shelf and slipped a note inside that read simply, "I see you." That note mattered more than any legal advice could at the time. I also discovered an email from Felicia to Greg with a subject line that read, "Plan for house, timeline," and a list beneath that included the phrase, "Rehome Dad to Bedford Lane." The phrase in cold text looked worse than the spoken word. At the grocery store, I overheard gossip, neighbors asking if I had sold or was selling. I felt stripped not just of items but of assumption. The assumption that a father's home remains his until he says otherwise. One afternoon, I confronted Felicia in the kitchen. I asked why she had never asked me what I wanted. She blinked, the practiced pause of someone momentarily exposed. "We thought we knew what was best," she said. I realized then how far they had fallen from the children who once learned their lessons at my elbow. The structural shifts were not merely physical. They were cultural. They suggested a new story in which I occupied a lesser role. Greg's mother, Mabel, started visiting more often, adding her voice to the chorus of concern. Joseph began to drop by with practical suggestions about square footage and heating bills. It felt as if a map had been redrawn in which my hometown had been moved to the margins. And yet, despite everything, people continued to speak to me with warmth at the table. They used words like help and care as though those words could cover the quiet theft. They divided the house's functions and assigned me to a corner. The insult of being assigned a corner was worse than being forced into a room. It taught me that dignity is not just a matter of hearth and keys. It is how others presume you walk through the world. What they could not know, at least not yet, was that the act of packing had awakened a resolve in me. The crates, the removal of boxes, the shifting of photographs, these small violences had an opposite effect. They focused my attention, sharpened my will. If they meant to push me into a life where others made my choices, they had chosen the wrong man to try that with. I began to breathe differently, cataloging every insult, preparing quietly for the day I would act and take back my home and dignity. Ethan's words were the first real crack in the polite facade they'd constructed. He told me what he'd heard, and for the first time the idea of being moved felt less like rumor and more like scheduled labor. It happened on a quiet Thursday. I was in the kitchen washing a plate when Ethan came in, his hair still damp from the shower, the house slippers too big on his feet. He looked like a boy who had borrowed an adult's coat and found it heavy. He said nothing at first, only stacked dishes and rerouted his eyes toward the sink. Then, in a voice so low I had to lean in to hear, he said, "They put down a deposit at Bedford Lane." He did not say much else. He did not need to. The name Bedford Lane landed in me like a pebble dropped into a still pool, making circles I could not ignore. I had heard the name in passing, Felicia's mention of a community that would be good for social activities, but I had not imagined the mechanics. A deposit meant logistics. Fees, dates, room numbers. It meant that decision had already begun without me. Ethan explained that he'd overheard Greg on a phone call. They liked the show Sweet, he said, and laughed, but his laugh had no joy. He said they had toured facilities in North Salem and chosen one with a view of pine trees and a dining hall with blue napkins. The mundane details made it colder, more real. The children had been coached, Ethan admitted, to think of it as, for your safety. When I asked why no one had told me, he looked at his hands and said, "They said it would be easier this way." That easier felt like thin ice over a deep lake. I asked questions not to the parents, who had become practiced in the art of placid assurance, but to neighbors and to the small-town rhythms that watch over everyone. I started checking mail more closely. I made a list of names of people who had come by, the times of their visits, and the topics that surfaced. I learned to pick up the cadence of a sentence that had been rehearsed. It was in that cadence I first found the word guardianship. One afternoon, a brochure slipped under my door. It was glossy and trimmed with tasteful photos of communal dining and smiling seniors playing cards. The front read, "Bedford Lane, a community that cares." Inside were testimonials and a small print clause about deposits and residency terms. I circled the clause with a fountain pen and felt foolishly childish for needing to do so. But those lines, legal phrases about conservatorship meetings, about required medical evaluations, shifted the battle from familiar hurt into the world of law. I spoke to Ethan about going to a lawyer. He flinched. He was only 17 and child laws are not a teenager's specialty. "They'll make it messy," he said. "They'll say you can't manage. They'll say it's for your safety." He looked afraid that any challenge would put a wedge between him and his parents. That fear, more than anything, kept him quiet. I knew then that confrontation could be framed against me as the actions of an irrational old man. I had to be strategic. I began keeping copies of bank envelopes, writing down names of visitors, noting when Greg left and returned. I learned how to make small things into a trail. I called Mrs. Holland to ask about Bedford Lane. She'd heard families used it when children were busy. I tucked that away. I recalled Erica's counsel. Plan before you need to, Frank, and felt that old advice become the thin map I would follow. It steadied me in a way anger could not truly. They called it a family meeting, which in their mouths made it sound like a democratic town hall instead of the orchestration it was. I sat at the head of the table as if I had always belonged there, though the silence around me had more teeth than conversation. Felicia set out brochures on the oak table like exhibits. The glossy photos of Bedford Lane looked warm and inviting. The sun made the dining area pictures glow as if they were promising a gentle afterlife. They each took turns explaining. Felicia spoke of social calendars and clubs. Greg enumerated caregiver schedules and medical staff, and Mabel offered theatrical praise at every pause. Even Joseph had practical questions about space and heating that felt like endorsements. They framed it as kindness. "Father," Felicia said, touching my hand with a practiced tenderness, "Bedford Lane would be so good for you. You could make friends, they have activities, and the staff are wonderful." Her words were sugar beneath which a bitter pill slid. Greg added, in a tone that tried to balance corporate assurance with familial concern, that if I refused they might have to consider conservatorship to protect me. The landmines were laid softly. I asked for time, because I needed to understand what they meant by care. They assured me there was nothing to worry about. The deposit was refundable and the community flexible. Yet as I looked around the room, I could see the plan in the way they had rehearsed their lines. They spoke of timing as if the calendar was a machinery they had already set in motion. "We toured it last week," Greg said casually, as if the past tense absolved any need for consent. When I protested, the room grew strangely sterile. Felicia's eyes flickered. Greg's jaw tightened into a polite warning. He suggested, without dramatics, that if family decisions were called into question, there exists a legal process called guardianship, a way to ensure medical and financial decisions are made in your best interest. He framed it as neutral language. The cruelty was its administration. To be called incompetent in front of your family is a private violence. I listened more than I spoke. I asked questions that were meant to buy time, to sound reasonable while I gathered evidence in my mind. I asked about medication requirements and the doctor who had supposedly recommended the move. They produced a file of notes from a physician who had been kind, but cursory. I felt my autonomy enumerated in checkboxes. It was humiliating because it dressed disdain as concern. At the end of the meeting, when the coffee had thinned to its last dregs and the brochures had been set aside, they asked me to consider a moving date. My pride fought back. My practical mind calculated. I consented to a tentative date. It was not capitulation so much as a tactical choice. I knew by then that anger flashed and died. It would not protect me. What might, I decided, was patience paired with planning. I agreed to the date with a voice quiet and even. Walking to my bedroom that night, I noticed how unfamiliar my own home had become. The hall light threw new shadows. The photo frames had been moved again. Some of Erica's embroidered linens had gone missing. It was as if the house was reassembling itself around a story I was no longer allowed to tell. I packed a small bag that evening. 2 shirts, some underclothes, the toothbrush I never left behind. Because even decisions made in smallness can be defiant. Before bed, I took out a small legal pad and began to write. Dates, names, hints, the time Greg left to look at work, and the day Felicia called the doctor. I made lists of small things that felt like evidence in the making. I knew the law could sometimes move slower than heartache, but paper never lied. I began drafting letters in my head, the words hot and legal and certain. I would send them when the time was right. That night I told myself a curious thing. I would go to Bedford Lane if that was the cost of buying back my story. I would not do so because I was broken. I would do so to learn the map. From inside that map I could find exits and doors. I slept with the brochures under my pillow as if to study their promises. The outward accommodation was a cloak. Inside I sharpened details, turned grievances into a ledger, and set my quiet plan in motion. Ethan's furtive glance that night told me he would try to help when he could, even if quietly. The first lesson Bedford Lane taught me was that confinement wears the mask of care. They brought me there with the politeness of people who believed compassion could be packaged. The reception had orchids, a smiling attendant, and a wall of brochure photos promising sunlight and community. The reality was less picturesque, a humming air of televisions left on for company, a cart clattering down a linoleum corridor, a faint scent of lemon cleaner that softened into something older, like memory erased. My room was small, 8 by 9, with a narrow bed and a single window that framed the lake like a postcard. The nightstand held a laminated card with emergency numbers and rules. A clock ticked with a precision that made time feel official. The sheets were generic. The blanket had seen too many wash cycles. Privacy frayed into schedules. Dignity thinned into routine. At first I resisted in small ways that felt almost ceremonial. I refused paper cups and kept my ceramic mug. I folded a handkerchief the way Erica had taught me. Those tiny rituals kept pieces of me intact. But the biggest wound was how people spoke of residents as tasks. Nurses and aides discussed mobility and intake with a clinical detachment that flattened persons into checkboxes. Felicia visited those first days, bringing sugar cookies that remained untouched. Her smile felt staged. The visits faded quickly. Felicia's calls grew short. Greg's excuses multiplied. Their presence turned intermittent as if they were content the arrangements had been set in motion. It felt as if my life had been shrunk to allow for the insertion of other lives into my house. But Bedford Lane, for all its indignities, became an unlikely school. I learned the rhythm of medications, the procession to the dining hall, the days when the bus took residents to appointments. I learned names, people with histories, not charts, and began to meet them. A woman named Lillian painted watercolors of the lake with a ferocity that made me think she was holding on to light. A retired teacher told me about a summer she'd spent on Cape Cod. The memory made her face bloom. Dennis Leo found me in that way some allies find you. by proximity and a look that asked if you had noticed the same things. He had been a pharmaceutical salesman who learned to keep his mind keen even as his body betrayed him. He was quiet but curious. His eyes fixed on details others missed. One afternoon in the common room he leaned over, tapped the arm of my chair and said, "Do you still own the house?" It was a question with the weight of a lever. Ownership had been a name on a deed for years, abstract until then. Dennis's question turned it into a possible tool. "Yes," I answered. My voice surprised me. He smiled in a way that suggested relief rather than triumph. He did not offer pity. He offered curiosity and tactics. Verify the deed, check tax records, keep copies of mail. He mentioned Declan, his nephew, a realtor who liked puzzles. "Real estate people love a tidy paper trail," Dennis said. "If they've been sloppy, we can be tidy." I kept a ledger beneath the mattress. Dates, names, visitors, the times Greg left in his car. I noticed who brought pastries, who lingered in my study, who asked about my mail. I read the community board and circled notices about legal clinics and seminars. At a clinic, I learned basic language about conservatorship and competency, a vocabulary that had been used as a threat in my home. Dennis gave me Declan's number on a folded napkin and advised me to make copies of tax statements and to request a current deed from the county office. "Paper is slow but stubborn," he said. "It does not forget." I practiced explaining my finances aloud until the sentences came steady. If anyone later tried to frame me as incapable, I intended to present a calm, documented man rather than an aggrieved elder. Bedford Lane afforded me observation. I watched Greg's patterns through the window. A contractor's van parked one afternoon, a moving company there another. I noted the box labeled records, carried from the house on a Tuesday. None of that proved criminal, but the accumulation of details built a picture of intent. I wrote each item in my ledger like laying a brick. People in that facility had various stories, and their company steadied me. Lillian's watercolors captured mornings I wanted to remember. Harold taught me an odd trick of crossword clues that made me laugh. Those human threads reminded me that living involves more than legal battles. It involves the daily dignity of being seen. At night, the window offered a lake that did not take sides. Sometimes despair came like a wave that made the room too small. Other nights resolve tightened like a muscle. I turned waiting into a discipline. I practiced patience and paperwork with equal fervor. Dennis was my strategist and sometimes my conscience. He reminded me that dignity required action, not only sentiment. Bedford Lane, intended to manage my life, had unexpectedly taught me the architecture of resistance. In a place designed to simplify me into schedules, I learned to collect details, to build a paper trail, and to marshal friends and allies. It was a strange education, but one I welcomed. The walls that had first felt like confinement began to feel like the walls of a workshop, where small, deliberate efforts would later create space for a return. I began discreetly contacting old acquaintances, reaching out to a lawyer Dennis recommended, and speaking with Declan. Every call, every note, felt like a reclamation, quiet, methodical, patient, and utterly necessary. It felt like breathing with purpose. If allies arrive suddenly, they often carry ordinary faces and unexpected patience. Dennis had steady hands for thinking but not for opening jars. He slid Declan's number across a napkin the first week I met him and described his nephew as a problem solver who likes making paper tidy. Declan's voice over the phone was brisk and businesslike, the kind of voice that treats a house as both architecture and ledger. He agreed to meet me at the house under the guise of valuing the property, which was convenient because Felicia welcomed any sign of interest from a realtor. Declan was younger than I expected, efficient, tapping measurements on his phone and noting where sun warmed the floors. He walked the rooms with a respectful gaze, noticing thumb-smudged windows and the loose stair tread. He did not speak like a man there to seize a story. He spoke like a man cataloging it respectfully. He also spoke plainly. "You own it, Frank?" he asked on the porch, taking in the view. I told him the legal history. Erica's earlier claim in the divorce, the court's decision years ago naming me sole owner. He nodded, not with idle sympathy but like a mechanic checking a machine's oil. "Good," he said. "That matters." He introduced legal terms casually: title, deed, encumbrance, then sketched options. Sell and lease a cottage back, include a life estate clause, or sell to someone who would build a guest house specifically for me. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. I would not have to fight custody of my home as a battle. I could convert ownership into freedom by selling on terms that preserved my dignity. Declan sketched options and explained how a buyer who respected the house's history could be matched to protective clauses. I felt relief because the plan transformed the narrative. Instead of being boxed in by guardianship threats, I could use law to reclaim agency. But before action there was bureaucracy. Declan recommended I gather a certified deed copy, tax records, and mortgage documents. He suggested a discreet title search to ensure no surprises. He offered to match buyers to the kind of person who would appreciate the house's history rather than wipe it clean. He warned that certain public acts, storing boxes, forwarding mail, could be misread as abandonment. People mistake familiarity for ownership, he said. We must act before the record shows otherwise. We sketched a terse plan. Declan would vet buyers quietly. I would gather documents. Dennis would watch for suspicious activity. Declan began quietly circulating feelers to vetted buyers and flagged anyone likely to complicate things. He visited often, folder in hand, asking about utility bills, maintenance schedules, and who had which keys. He photographed details and made notes with a calm professionalism that steadied me more than I expected. I learned two things in those meetings. First, people and property work in ledgers where sentiment can be negotiated with clauses. Second, those closest to you sometimes assume their desire equals right. Felicia treated ownership like a social fact. Declan treated ownership like a legal fact that could protect or be protected with the right paper. I felt cautious hope. Each step demanded patience, paperwork, secrecy. I practiced explanations and kept the ledger tidy, rehearsing dates and names. Small, deliberate acts built momentum. Each move made reclaiming my home feel less dreamlike and distinctly attainable with steady, quiet determination. There is a peculiar clarity that comes when you read the paper that proves your name belongs somewhere. Erica had been loud about ownership in our marriage. She argued once during the divorce that the house was hers by right of contribution and will. I remember the din of that period. Lawyers, declarations, the rustle of typed pages. At the time, the court examined records and finally issued a ruling that named me sole owner. It was settled then, a legal dot on a map I thought permanent. When Declan suggested a title search, I thought it a formality. He explained it was not. Paper has layers, he said, and sometimes lies like an onion. He cautioned that public behavior, storing boxes, forwarding mail, could be used to suggest abandonment or implied consent. They treat ownership as a family fact, he said. You need to prove it's a legal fact. So I ordered the records. I sat in the county clerk's office while a clerk scanned microfiche and pulled copies for me. The deed had my name spelled out in a way that made me proud, and the chain of title was clean for decades. Erica's name appeared in a note, a contested claim in her divorce filings, but the final judgment awarded the property to me. Seeing that stamped paper was like finding a compass. Suddenly the route back was mapped. But law is not only what a piece of paper says. Law is how people interpret action. Declan's warning echoed. People conflate presence with ownership. If Felicia's family could show they had been occupying without protest for a period, a judge might interpret the matter differently. That hypothetical felt like a thundercloud. I hired a lawyer, Harriet, whom Declan recommended. Harriet had a brisk manner. She told me to collect everything. Tax statements, utility bills, bank statements, anything showing continued payment and responsibility. She said, paper can defend you as well as it defines you. And resolve. So I began the clerical work of a man in his 70s learning to make paper fight for him. I requested certified copies of deeds, printed tax receipts, and photographs of my name on file. I obtained probate documents related to Erica's estate and gathered mail proofs showing bills addressed to me and paid by me. Each sheet of paper felt like a small sword. Harriet explained the other risk Felicia had tried to weaponize. Guardianship. They'll say it's for your safety, she said. Courts prefer less adversarial solutions, but conservatorship happen. She described hearings, medical evaluations, and how difficult it can be to resist without clear documentation. We scheduled an independent medical examination to document my fitness. The doctor's report would sit in our files like a shield. I learned the vocabulary of protection: deed, title, affidavit, conveyance, life estate. Each term mapped to a defensive step. Harriet drafted a declaration showing my intent to remain decision-maker and prepared a letter to the conservatorship board should anyone try to file. It felt oddly like packing armor. Declan checked for liens and encumbrances and found none. He framed the sale in terms that would be defensible. An amicable sale to a buyer who would agree to a living arrangement for me. He recommended specific language to make the sale appear voluntary and fully documented. Sometimes the technical language overwhelmed me, but Harriet translated bureaucracy into human terms. She reminded me that dignity could be preserved by documentation as much as by demeanor. Erica's old correspondence, which once had been used against us, now offered context. Evidence the house had been the subject of argument, not a tacit family right. Paperwork is tedious, but each copied tax bill, notarized statement, and county stamp felt like an affirmation. When the file was complete, Harriet put an elastic band around it and said, "We're ready." I clenched the folder like a talisman. For the first time since they walked in with suitcases, I felt steadier. The deed, the tax receipts, the doctor's report. These were not glamorous weapons, but they were durable. They reminded me that even when people you love become adversaries, the law could be a neutral stage where properly documented truth still mattered. There is a peculiar pleasure in watching a plan that was once an ember become a visible flame. Once the paperwork lay in order and Harriet had stamped our files, Declan moved from advisor into executor. He began calling a small list of buyers he trusted. People who liked properties with personality and who accepted clauses preserving previous occupants' dignity. He mentioned one name that lodged itself in my mind. Dean Cooker, a retired grocery magnate who had turned his attention to lakefront properties and preferred places with character. Declan described Dean as a man who loved porches and the feel of a good hearth. "He's not a strip-it and flip-it type," Declan said. "He builds rental cottages and appreciates history. He'll be your kind of buyer if we find the right terms." The terms were sensible: a fair market sale, a clause guaranteeing my right to a custom-built guest house on the grounds, and a recorded right of occupancy such as a life tenancy provision. The idea was daring and practical. To sell and simultaneously preserve residence was to turn ownership into an instrument of liberation. It made the sale not surrender but trade. Freedom for property, civility exchanged rather than stolen. Declan assured me he could find buyers willing to accept such language and to execute the transaction quickly and quietly so Felicia and Greg would have little time to interfere. We began a private choreography. Declan arranged viewings to match Bedford Lane day trips. I would be part of the group. Dennis promised to write routine notes and to nudge staff to release me for appointments. For a man who preferred being unnoticed, orchestrating these small deceptions felt oddly righteous. Dean arrived one afternoon in a truck that smelled of tobacco and coffee, a man with soft hands who wandered the rooms as if listening to the house. He asked about the neighborhood, about taxes, and then, to my surprise, about me. He listened when I told him about Erica and about what the house had meant. Declan steered the conversation toward terms: guest house, living arrangement, and legal language to protect my occupancy. Dean found the idea appealing. "I'll make sure it's yours," he said. We discussed where the guest house might sit, the cottage style I preferred, and the timeline. Dean proposed a fair market offer, enough to allow for legal fees and renovations. Confidentiality was essential. Declan set up escrow terms so funds were held discreetly. Harriet prepared affidavits confirming my competence and intent to guard against claims of coercion. The work felt ridiculous. Clauses and signatures replacing fists, but that legal scaffolding was our armor. Every signature, every notarization, reduced the leverage Felicia had tried to manufacture. We turned instruments of law into tools of protection. Declan coordinated contractors and estimators. Dennis managed day trips, and I maintained the ledger. When the offer arrived, clean, fair, and generous, I felt dissonant joy. The house that had been a trap could become a bridge. We arranged a swift closing date and ensured escrow would fund the guesthouse construction in milestones. The plan was no longer a thought. It was a schedule, a list of dates and signatures marching toward a public reveal that would be quiet yet undeniable. Steadily. If life becomes theater, then sometimes the most ordinary props, bus schedules, mailbags, appointment slips, become part of a larger set. Declan insisted on discretion. He set up viewings that matched Bedford Lane day trips, arranged notaries during medical appointments, and advised that every move must appear ordinary. Dennis would write a routine note, medical appointment, return by 5, and the staff accepted it because they trusted him. It was small stagecraft. The illusion had to be credible. I learned to move like someone forgetting they were on stage. I timed departures to coincide with the scheduled bus pickup and returned under the guise of a day out. Once, to test the mimicry, I wore a cap and carried a stack of envelopes to look like a visiting volunteer. Once I even posed momentarily as a postman, walking up the path and pretending to deliver a parcel. It was ridiculous and effective. It let me see who came and left and when. Declan handled buyers quietly. He met Dean at a diner and whispered details over coffee. Dean preferred transactions with a low commotion signature and liked the guesthouse clause. He called it keeping the soul. He agreed to a price and signed a letter of intent with a confidentiality clause. Declan then set escrow terms so funds would be held without alerting anyone. For added security, Declan used a trust and third-party escrow to transfer funds and prevent last-minute claims from freezing assets. Harriet drafted language ensuring the sale would be final and that the buyer would be bound by recorded agreements. Legal mechanics aren't glamorous, but they were our armor. There were tense days. Once a contractor called to say Felicia had mentioned considering selling in a laundromat. Gossip had begun. Another afternoon a moving van pulled in and my heart sank, but Declan had arranged a benign inspection that explained it away. We learned to read small alarms and check them quickly. On the morning of the closing, the small maneuvers converged. Declan had arranged for the title company. Harriet prepared affidavits. Dean's check was wired into escrow with confirmation codes. I wore my best jacket and tucked the ledger into my bag like a talisman. Felicia remained outwardly unknowing. She hosted parties and spoke of plans, oblivious that the house's future had been negotiated in ink. I wondered whether she felt the prick of unease that precedes discovery. She continued to speak of Bedford Lane with practiced care, as if distance from me had become a policy. We scheduled the closing quietly. I watched while Declan carried documents and Harriet stamped forms. The deed transferred, and for a heartbeat the world tilted. There is gravity in ink. It binds differently than pleas. When the final pages were signed, Declan instructed the title company to record the deed immediately. Once recorded, no casual claim could erase it. Afterward, Declan and Harriet arranged a brief period for contractors to finalize the guesthouse footprint, an interval to avoid suspicion. Dean advanced construction funds and escrow held the guesthouse money in milestones. The recorded agreement became a public ring fence around my life. We set the reveal at Mabel's birthday party, an event Felicia had planned. Declan suggested letting them have the party in the house and revealing the sale at its height. It was public, undeniable, and resistant to whispered denials. Declan wanted consequence more than cruelty, reasoning that truth in public would correct private spin. I remember standing in the altered rooms before the party and feeling not triumph but a firm reclamation. Legal, measured, and final. The cloak and dagger had ended not with clamor but with the calm inevitability of ink and record. The house had been sold, and the papers told the truth in a way memories sometimes cannot. The closing felt less like a victory and more like a small, resolute exhale that finally loosened a knot in my chest. The papers smelled of ink and office coffee. Declan arrived early with a folio. Harriet followed with a hospital-stern calm, and Dean Cooker sat like a man who had learned to wait for things to be done. We sat at a long table while the title agent recited the ritual of names and numbers. I had practiced the lines I would say if asked. My reasons, my timeline, but mostly I listened. Signing felt ceremonial yet intimate. Each signature slid into a place and connected the past to a future in a way words had failed to do. Declan pointed out the escrow instructions. Harriet confirmed the wire transfers, and the clerk stamped copies with a thud that sounded like a metronome to the heart. When I handed the pen for the last signature, I felt the air shift. Legal gravity took hold. The funds moved into escrow and an email confirmed the green line transfer. Declan cracked a rare smile. Harriet folded her hands. Dean gripped my shoulder and spoke of the guest house as if it were already built. Cedar shingles, a porch where mornings could be measured in coffee spoons. The clauses we had negotiated were not polite gestures. They were binding promises. My right to occupy a cottage built on the property, a life tenancy provision recorded with the deed. After the signing, we walked to the county office while the afternoon leaned slow. I watched a clerk press an ink stamp into paper, the public mark that makes a private contract recognizably true. The record, once entered, is stubborn. That statement of fact shifted the ground beneath some plans I knew had been made without my consent. Walking through the rooms afterward felt bizarre. What had been a private geography of memories, Erica's teacups, the marks on the banister, was now traversed by the knowledge that ownership would change hands on paper. I felt a peculiar combination of loss and relief. Selling the house meant renaming rooms from personal to property, but the guest house clause meant I would remain present, not evicted into absence. Neighbors did what neighbors do. They asked questions, offered rhubarb, and assumed motives. Mrs. Holland gave me a jar of preserves and said, "You did the right thing, Frank," as if there had been a single obvious right choice. Mr. Phelps patted my shoulder and offered condolences with the awkwardness of someone uncertain which sympathy best fits a man who sold his house by choice. Rumor is a quick-footed thing in small towns. Within hours whispers began, painting versions of the story that had less to do with recorded deeds and more to do with gossip. Harriet advised we let the record speak and not to feed the rumor mill. She drafted letters to the tax office and utilities to confirm continuity of billing. Procedures that now felt like armor as much as courtesy. That evening Dean and I sat on the porch and ate slices of warm apple bread he swore his mother baked better than any recipe book. We spoke of practicalities, where the guest house might sit, how a handrail should be built for winter, which maples to preserve, and of small things that were not legalities but life. Dean listened when I told stories of Erica. He listened as if the house were still a story worth honoring. I thought, too, of Felicia and Greg and what their faces might be when the recording posted and the official public record contradicted their assumed entitlement. I did not crave their ruin. I wanted them to understand consequence. Choices made at the expense of another's dignity have bearings beyond convenience. When I went to bed that night, the house was quiet and the ledger I had kept sat on my nightstand. The signature page was now part of the public story, but the ledger, my notes, dates, receipts, remained a private proof. There was no triumph that felt loud. Instead, there was a careful correction, a reassertion of agency in a world that had tried to make my age a liability rather than a fact of life. The sale had been a methodical act. Paperwork, witnesses, recorded promises. It returned to me a choice I had been denied. The documents would not erase the months of humiliation, but they converted anger into structure and restored a measure of dignity. The papers had become my way back into a life I intended to live on my own terms. Before the legalities were complete, Ethan called and his voice carried a relief that made me teary in private. He spoke in fits and starts about weekend visits, about helping stack firewood, about bringing a chair so I could watch the lake while he worked nearby. His gratitude felt like balm. Harriet also finalized our defense materials. Affidavits from neighbors, the independent medical exam confirming my competence, and formal notices filed with the county tax office proving continuous payment. Those documents were tedious but essential. They turned my story from claim to record. It is odd to say paperwork can feel humane, but these pages made possible a future where I would not be treated as invisible. That night, I slept with the ledger beside me and the knowledge that the next morning belonged to me and firmly. The silence that followed my entrance felt louder than any sermon I had ever heard. The party had been loud and bright in my absence. Balloons, a catering table, laughter spilling through rooms I knew intimately. Felicia had arranged everything down to playlist and napkin color. She moved through her guests with the practiced ease of someone who had already written the script. Greg played the charming host, laughing in precisely the places he had rehearsed. The house had been transformed into their stage and they had invited an audience. I remember standing in the threshold and thinking the room looked splendid for the wrong reasons. I had not come to dramatize but to conclude. Dean and I arrived quietly. Dean in his sensible jacket, me and the jacket Erica liked. We entered through the side door as if we belonged. No one stopped us. Conversation faltered as familiar faces turned, the sound folding up into a stunned hush. Felicia saw me first, her smile catching and then curdling as confusion crossed her face. Greg's color changed in an instant. His cordial mask hardened. I introduced Dean simply. "This is Dean Cooker, the new owner of this property." The words landed like a measured strike. Some guests laughed nervously. Others looked at one another with raised eyebrows. Mabel clapped at the start of the announcement as if understanding any chorus of voices required immediate participation. But then her smile dropped. Felicia stumbled through a denial. "What are you talking about? You can't." And Greg went immediately to legal threats. "That sale is illegal. You were coerced." He tried to speak loudly enough to manufacture authority, but Harriet sat at the edge of the crowd and produced a medical report and a copy of the deed, both stamped and official. The atmosphere changed. The speech fell away into a series of murmurs and attempts at private negotiation. I spoke then not to shame but to make a point. "You made your choice when you prioritized convenience over my dignity," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I laid out the simple facts. The sale had been vetted, funds in escrow, deed recorded, and an independent physician's evaluation on file that attested to my competence. I told them the guesthouse clause guaranteed me a right to occupy for as long as needed, and that the buyer valued the history of the house. Greg accused me of trickery. He called me names that stung because they were familiar. Old man, stubborn relic. The insults seemed designed to rally the room, but the room was already half stranger now, and neighbors murmured about other things. The shrimp tray, the odd arrangement of chairs, the way a friend had commented on the house a week ago. People shifted. Whispers rippled like wind through late summer grass. Mabel floated a sentimental argument. "This is my birthday, can't we not make bones about it?" But even she looked smaller, the center of her day suddenly shadowed by scandal. Joseph stormed forward, his face red, demanding lawyers and threatening to file suit. Dean raised his hand in a small, calming gesture and offered to meet privately with anyone who had questions about the terms. His calm was practical. His presence deflated some of the theatrical outrage. Guests took sides in whispers. Some expressed sympathy for Felicia. Others, who had known me longer, offered small nods of recognition when they saw the deed. An older couple I had known waved me over and, in a quiet aside, told me they had always thought the house belonged to this family in a way that needed respect. The tenor of gossip is merciful in alien ways. It returned pieces of reputation when ink on a public record could. The humiliation was not in the remark or in a single face. It was the publicness. Pride is private. Humiliation loves an audience. I had chosen this. I had not wanted to shame them. I had wanted public clarity that would check their narrative. The 21-day notice I had calculated would give them time to find alternatives while making clear the ownership had legally shifted. Felicia's anger finally found a focus. "You don't have to do this in front of everyone," she cried. The accusation was a mirror. She had orchestrated her plans in front of friends and family, and suddenly the exposure forced a reckoning she had not expected. She accused me, then paused, as if searching for a path that would not reveal complicity. In the next days the house hummed with new energy. Phone calls, whispered consultations, and the shuffling of plans. Some friends offered to help Felicia find a place. Some offered to mediate. For me, the event closed a painful chapter. It was not revenge as spectacle but something quieter. A public correction that used record and witness rather than rudeness. That night the party's remnants lay about. Confetti caught in corners, an unfinished cake, and I walked through the rooms thinking of how rooms hold memory and how they can be returned to a life of respect. The public reveal had been necessary. I had decided dignity was not to be bartered for temporary kindness, and the record had made the choice precise. Ethan hugged me later that night, and his whispered, "I'm proud of you," soothed a wound I had carried like a bruise for years now. The days after the party felt like waking into a world that had finally chosen to tell the truth. At first there was a flurry of legal threats that ricocheted off the armor of ink. Joseph hired a lawyer and threatened to file suit, citing coercion and alleging the signature had been gained under pressure. Greg paced and sent terse messages, some angry, some pleading, their tone shifting like weather. Felicia alternated between denial and small, imploring apologies that sounded rehearsed. Their fury felt less dangerous than their surprise. When people expect entitlement, its removal can create panic. We had prepared for noise. Harriet had filed the independent medical evaluation that proved my capacity and sent notarized affidavits showing consistent tax payments and mortgage handling. She had anticipated conservatorship scenarios and already drafted responses. The legal threats that Joseph mounted were combated by documentation. A recorded deed, escrow confirmations, and a life tenancy clause that created a clear, recorded right in public record. In court terms, paperwork often speaks louder than outbursts. Still, there were sharp edges. The first formal letter arrived, a demand for rescission, and I watched as Felicia's name signed arrayed across legal paper in a way that made the wound feel sharp anew. Her handwriting looked ordinary and betraying. I expected vitriol in the press of neighbors and acquaintances, but some people were kinder than I had expected. A few old friends offered neutral statements acknowledging my management of the property over years. Others stayed quiet. Even in conflict, small acts of recognition steadied me. Greg's panic became more noticeable when contractors mentioned that a previous box labeled records had gone to storage. Those were important, he insisted when Declan explained the legal timeline. They show intent. But intent, when documented in deeds and tax receipts, had a way of receding into the background behind law's neat precision. He came to a mediation once with a counsel who smiled too much. The meeting ended in curt handshakes and a mutual realization that further legal action would likely prove costly and slow. At home, the Guesthouse foundation was laid and I watched the first posts go into the ground. It felt strange to see a new structure begin on the edge of a property I had cherished, but it felt like a promise rather than a theft. Workers measured and leveled. They made jokes about the weather. They carried beams with the easy rhythm of people used to building rather than taking. Dean visited often and sat in his truck writing notes while watching the work. Sometimes he would stand at the site and imagine how the porch light would look in winter, and in those moments I felt less like someone being managed and more like a person with a place to be. Felicia tried to rally sympathy among mutual friends, claiming that our family had been fractured by sudden action. Some community members were torn. Loyalty is messy in towns where people have histories that overlap. Yet when Harriet published the medical report and the deed was made public, the tide of casual sympathies shifted. A few neighbors apologized for jumping to conclusions. A local priest wrote a note about the complex ethics of elder care. It was small consolation, but it steadied me. Guilt, surprisingly, crept into my own heart. Part of me mourned what we had lost. Conversations with my daughter that once had warmth. Holidays without bitter edges. I wondered whether a kinder approach might have preserved relationship without conceding my autonomy. But a harder fact remained. Dignity is rarely reclaimed through gentle request when the other side assumes power. Ethan and Nathan became bridges. They visited, sometimes bringing jars of preserves and sometimes with jokes about the contractor's coffee being too weak. They cleaned gutters and mended a loose stair tread for me. Their presence reminded me, again, where attachment matters. They had seen the ugliness and chosen to act differently. One afternoon Felicia came by alone, unannounced and pale, and sat on the porch steps. She asked, haltingly, if we might talk. Her apology was torn and messy. She admitted that in the convenience of her plan she had treated me as a problem rather than a person. I listened. Her words were not absolution, but they were honest. I told her the boundaries I intended to keep, respect in visitations, decisions made with my consent, and no attempts to undermine the legal protections in place. She nodded, the gesture of someone learning a new script. In mediation, Greg's lawyer finally acknowledged that a protracted court fight would be costly and public, and the threat evaporated into negotiation. Some doors that had been closed remained closed, but other doors opened in small ways. I received letters from old colleagues who recalled hiring me as a young salesman, and a former client sent a note about the dignity of steady work. These small affirmations did not erase pain, but they helped stitch a new pattern of belonging, and I learned to breathe again today. The first morning in the guest house smelled like cedar and a hope that had been built into beams. I woke to a view of the lake framed by a window that had been measured to catch the first light. The guest house was small but honest. Hardwood floors, a modest stone hearth, a porch that fit 2 chairs and a small table. Declan had been meticulous about details. Dean insisted the handrail be low enough that I could rest an elbow on it and watch seasons arrive. The builders left a note pinned to the door that read, "Built with respect," and I kept it. Moving in felt strange. The main house still carried the texture of decades. The cottage was a new chapter stitched into that fabric. I carried a box of Erica's linens, laid a cup on the kitchen shelf she used to use, and arranged a photograph of her on the mantel. The act of placing those objects into the guest house felt like giving myself permission to continue loving the past while still living in the present. Dean and I settled into rhythms. He dropped by most nights and sometimes brought a jar of preserves or a piece of news from town. We shared dinners on the back porch and found the conversation easy. He told me stories about running a store, a life of ledgers, people, and long afternoons, and I told him about sales calls and the small rituals of visiting doctors that had once filled my week. There was companionship that required no rescue. It simply fit. Ethan and Nathan came by often. They helped plant a small herb garden near the porch and argued good-naturedly about whether basil or thyme would thrive best in lake air. They brought tools and jokes, and sometimes they sat and said little, their presence a kind of warm insurance against loneliness. I found that grandchildren have a way of making future days feel like good investments. I resumed my old walks along the lane, though I no longer passed the big front door every day. Instead, I walked beside the lake and watched people go about their mornings. The neighbor with a border collie, the woman who painted watercolors by the dock, the fisherman who cursed gently at their luck. Small routines stitched days into meaning. The newspaper at breakfast, a slow cup of tea, a letter left in my mailbox now addressed to me at the guest house. There were practicalities to manage. The guest house required maintenance and decisions about utilities, and Dean consulted me about paint samples and where to site a small trellis for climbing roses. These conversations were ordinary, but they mattered because they were mine to make. I had regained the authority to decide what color my porch would be and who might sleep upstairs during the summer when family came to visit. Sometimes evenings brought long silences where memory pressed hard. I would stand by the window and see Erica's silhouette in the dark reflection, and the ache would arrive like a visitor. But grief and joy learned to share space. I wrote letters, some returned, some not, and in the margins I put plans, a small gathering in autumn, a shelf of books I hadn't yet read, a list of recipes to try with Dean's guidance. A small finishing celebration followed when the last shingle was nailed and the hearth tested. Declan brought a modest bottle of wine. Dean prepared a simple supper, and a few neighbors delivered pies. We sat around the new table, talking about lamp placement and whose photograph would sit on the mantel. The gathering was not triumphant so much as grateful, a quiet sealing of a practical covenant. Soon after, I took to volunteering at the local library one morning each month, shelving books and listening as children recited poems. Mrs. Holland visited with knitting and tea and stories that made me laugh until the worry inside me loosened. Small civic acts, an errand for a neighbor, a note to a friend, built days that felt worthwhile. Through ordinary rituals I stitched together a life that was both new and wholly mine, and quietly content now. The day Felicia returned with an apology, the sky was an ordinary blue that made the moment feel almost domestic. When she knocked, I was in the kitchen making coffee, the air smelling faintly of cinnamon. She looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders turned inward by months of visible regret. Greg stood behind her, more defensive than repentant, and behind him Ethan held Gwen's hand with quiet caution. Felicia's apology was halting. She said she had been selfish and had failed to see how her help felt like taking. Her words were not theatrical but earnest, trembling where they needed to be. She asked if forgiveness was possible. I listened. Forgiveness, I thought, was not the same as trust returned. I told her what I needed, respect in speech so family visits would not be lessons in management, a genuine sharing of decisions rather than declarations, and absolute avoidance of any attempt to claim my property or autonomy again. I told her, too, that apologies were meaningful but only if coupled with changed behavior. She nodded and pressed her hands together as if anchoring her resolve. Greg offered a short, blunt apology and then, in a moment of awkward candor, asked if there might be a way to fix things. I said things are not fixed by optional gestures. They are rebuilt by consistent acts. He flinched. Later he dropped by with a small toolbox as a practical olive branch. He and I mended a loose stair tread together as a modest step toward rebuilding practical trust. Months passed. Felicia honored the boundaries more than I dared expect. Visits were scheduled, respectful in tone, and often included Ethan and Nathan helping with chores instead of hiding behind phones. There were dinners where conversation had the warmth of ordinary family talk rather than the tension of negotiation. It was not a return to what had been. It was a careful new pattern that acknowledged wrong and strove to do better. There were setbacks. A remark at a holiday table could still sting. A parade of arguments about inheritance passed like storms. But the difference was that we had introduced breaks. Conversations paused and reconciliations invoked rather than simmering resentments left to fester. Felicia sought counseling to reckon with entitlement that had guided some of her choices. I appreciated the effort even if I did not attend the sessions. Friends and neighbors observed the slow thaw with a range of responses. Some cheered the reconciliation as a necessary balm to family wounds, others remained appropriately skeptical. For me, the real measure was simpler. Did my days feel fuller and more mine? The answer was increasingly yes. I had a porch that caught the light, a guest house that matched my needs, and most importantly, people who were learning to treat me as someone whose preferences mattered. Once, not long after Felicia's apology, I attended a small community talk about elder rights that Harriet organized with the local library. She invited me to say a few words about autonomy and the quiet dignity of older people making choices. I spoke about the paper, the deeds, the medical exams, the affidavits, and about the human side. Naming what you will accept and refusing to hide your desire to decide. People came up afterward and thanked me for honest talk. It was odd to be a voice speaking to others who might be facing similar choices. In the evenings, Dean and I sat by the hearth and talked about ordinary things. Repairs, recipes, the precise time frogs would start their song in June. Those talks reminded me that dignity is daily. It is the right to pour your own cup and to place it where you like. I learned to appreciate the small decisions again. The color of curtains, the route of a walk, which books to keep on a shelf. By autumn, the guest house had become more than shelter. It was an instrument in which life was played out with intention. Felicia visited with the children and offered real help. Mending a hem, bringing soup when I had a cold. Acts that mattered because they were chosen freely rather than performed to salve guilt. Greg and I shared short, civil conversations about neighborhood matters. There was no easy warmth, but there was civility. The final scene that stayed with me was not dramatic. It was a Sunday morning, fog on the lake, Ethan teaching Gwen to skip stones. Felicia stood behind them, watching, and for a moment the three generations made a quiet tableau of something that had been mended slowly. I felt neither triumph nor vengeance, only a quiet sense that dignity had been reaffirmed, not through spectacle, but by boundaries, paperwork, and small acts of change. I kept Erica's sewing box in the cottage, and sometimes I open it to feel the quiet courage she left behind. When visitors ask what I learned, I say simply, guard your choices, document them, and live where respect is mutual. That, I believe, is how dignity endures and keep going. If you've stayed with me this far, I need you to think with me for a moment. When a house becomes a battlefield, what does dignity actually look like? Is it the right to make your own choices, or the way others treat those choices? How do we measure respect? By promises kept, by words, or by how we act when no one's watching? If independence is a life you defend, when is it time to defend it and when is it time to yield? After all I've been through, I ask you, what does restored identity mean to you? Is it forgiveness, or is it boundaries? And finally, where does responsibility begin? With those who care for elders or with elders themselves to protect their rights? Drop your thoughts below. Tell me your story. Tell me where you're watching from, and leave your take on dignity, respect, independence, restored identity, and responsibility. I'll be reading every comment.